In the early years of the Second World War, this plane, the de Havilland Mosquito, could fly faster and higher than any other operational aircraft in the world. As a warplane, it is perhaps the most perfect example of British genius for invention in the face of adversity. The Mosquito's fame, in the eyes of the public, has been overshadowed by the Battle of Britain and the glamour of the Spitfire. But the story of the Mosquito must be one of the most neglected and yet most significant in the history of aviation. For, in the age of the metal monoplane, this one was made almost entirely of wood. The Mosquito, or Moz as it was known affectionately by its pilots, achieved some of the most spectacular successes of the war. As a warplane, it was unequalled. It could fly very high and very low, far and fast. The pilots loved it, and their commanders relied on it. With bombs or guns, cameras or rockets, the Mozzie was a magnificent all-round fighting machine, something which is rarely ever achieved in aircraft design. It was in the tranquility of this typically English setting that the Mosquito was born. Salisbury Hall, near St Albans in Hertfordshire, has changed little in 300 years, a solid, if small, stately home. The present house dates from the 17th century, though there's been a building on this site in one form or another for over 1,000 years. Through the centuries, Salisbury Hall has been home to many a national figure, among them King Charles and Nell Gwyn, Sir Winston Churchill, and the great railway designer, Sir Nigel Gresley. It was in the summer of 1939 that Salisbury Hall played the vital role in a series of unlikely events which finally gave birth to the Mosquito. And that such events occurred at all was largely due to one man, Sir Geoffrey de Havilland, founder of the famous aircraft company. Sir Geoffrey was dedicated to the world of aeronautics. He designed his first aircraft, together with its engine, in 1910, at the age of 25. Over 1/3 of the Allied military aircraft which took part in the First World War were de Havilland designs, including the famous de Havilland bombers. After the war, the de Havilland Aircraft Company concentrated on civilian aircraft, including the record-beating Moth biplanes and twin-engined airliners. In the mid-1930s, Sir Geoffrey had the inspiration for a light day bomber built of wood. To de Havilland, the concept was not as revolutionary as one might expect, for the story really began in 1934 at Mildenhall Airfield in Suffolk. This was the start of the England to Australia air race. It was an event attracting worldwide interest, and heading the British entries was the twin-engined de Havilland 88, the de Havilland Comet, a racy design and constructed of wood. Piloted by C.W. Scott and T. Campbell Black, the Comet completed the 11,000-mile flight in a record-beating 71 hours to take the first prize of £10,000. In spite of its world-beating performance, the British government wasn't interested in the Comet as a military aircraft. 4 years later, in October 1938, Geoffrey de Havilland and his chief engineer C.C. Walker approached the Air Ministry with a plan for another wooden aircraft, an unarmed, high-speed bomber. The Ministry's response was predictable.
Military aircraft are no longer made of wood, and in view of the imminence of war, we cannot afford to divert our resources from proven designs to untested ones.
But it was not in Geoffrey de Havilland's character to accept defeat. By the time he'd returned to Hatfield from that meeting, he'd made the decision to go ahead in spite of the official attitude. Initial design work started immediately at the Hatfield factory, already occupied producing Tiger Moth biplane trainers, urgently needed by an expanding RAF. But as the political situation in Europe grew worse, there was an increased danger that the design team would be split up and redeployed on other projects by the Air Ministry. When war broke out in September 1939, changes in the aircraft industry became inevitable. The preliminary design for the Mosquito was well underway, and Sir Geoffrey, seeking to avoid the breakup of the team, decided to hide them from official eyes. Salisbury Hall, 6 miles down the road from the factory, provided the ideal place. The house, with its moat and its trees, would guarantee peace and security for the design team. So a choice made for purely practical reasons once again favoured historic Salisbury Hall. The design team arrived at Salisbury Hall early in October 1939. Ralph Hare, recently retired as Chief Stress Engineer of British Aerospace, was then a junior member of the team.
We very quickly became acquainted with the surroundings. We found it so different from the atmosphere at Hatfield in that although so much work was being carried out here, it was done in an atmosphere of informality. And that, I believe, helped the project enormously. The people involved were so much part of one another in terms of personal relationships, as well as the actual job that was carried out.
In December 1939 came the news of the first major breakthrough. A far-sighted Air Chief Marshal, Sir Wilfrid Freeman, had managed to get one prototype ordered, in spite of all the sustained official opposition to the project. But it was to be used for reconnaissance rather than as a bomber. In the corridors of Whitehall, it quickly became known as Freeman's Folly. In the spring of 1940, the war wasn't going well for the Allies. Work at Salisbury Hall was brought to a halt by a shortage of materials. After Dunkirk, the government had put a total ban on the supply of strategic war materials for unofficial projects. The Mosquito was formally cancelled by the Air Ministry. There was little activity here for the next 2 months, and then success. Wooden construction had carried the day. The Mosquito design didn't compete for the metals then urgently needed for the Battle of Britain fighters, and required only a small number of highly skilled machinists, then in critically short supply. But there was one almost impossible condition to the continued work. 50 aircraft must be ready in a year's time. It was an unheard of target for an aircraft virtually still in the design stage. But if such a target was to all practical purposes unattainable, the design team saw it as a challenge. With pressure of work at such a peak, the choice of Salisbury Hall was proving a good one.
We were working 6.5 days a week from 8 o'clock in the morning till 7 o'clock in the evening, and willing to do this. The offices were the bedrooms, the downstairs rooms, and we found that there was that sort of esprit de corps which was generated by the whole atmosphere, overall, of course, by the presence of Sir Geoffrey, who was always with us, helping us, encouraging us, and making a very big contribution to the effort, which turned out in the end to be very successful.
As a further vital saving of time, the first Mosquito was assembled in a large shed disguised as a barn directly behind the house. On the 25th of November 1940, the prototype, now transported to Hatfield, was ready for the first flight. It had been just over a year since design work had begun in earnest. This is not in fact the maiden flight. It was staged for an official propaganda film in 1942, but it captures something of the mood of the event. Sir Geoffrey and his team had staked their future, and in some ways Britain's as well, on the outcome of that misty November day. From the first moment that the Mosquito became airborne, it was a winner. The old adage, if it looks right, it'll fly right, was never more true. The first test flight lasted only 45 minutes, but with it, the future of de Havilland's much-maligned project was made secure. As the test flight programme went on, news of the aircraft's success reached Whitehall. Those who dubbed it Freeman's Folly were forced to eat their words. It now became known as the Wooden Wonder. In flight, the Mosquito was exceeding all predictions, and apart from a few minor setbacks, was, as far as pilots were concerned, proving to be a truly superb flying machine. With the test programme well underway, Whitehall was backing its newly discovered enthusiasm for the project with orders for quantity production. And the de Havilland factory at Hatfield was only one of the centres now engaged in mass construction. Because of the wooden airframe, subcontracting was a relatively simple operation. Before long, any firm with woodworking experience was pressed into production. A school desk manufacturer and a coach builder made wings. A piano factory and a coffin maker supplied smaller items. Even cottage industries contributed to the supply of parts. Production was to grow from 1 aircraft a week in the late months of 1941 to 24 a week in 1943. A total of over 5,500 machines were to be assembled by the end of the war. Quite a total for an unwanted design. The production figures are only a pale reflection of the impact the Mosquito made on the Royal Air Force at war. It excelled in just about every area of aerial warfare. As a bomber, it had been designed to carry 2,000 pounds of explosives to Berlin. The Mosquito could manage that and still be faster than the main enemy fighters. With such performance, the casualty figures for the crews began to fall, and the flyers responded with total dedication to the wooden wonder.
It has been said we were elitists, and I suppose in some ways that was true. It sounds rather arrogant, but with such an aircraft, with such potential and speed, that we had the most exciting sort of efforts to play with. We even used to polish our aircraft to get more speed out of it. My own individual aircraft, after polishing it, would do about another 15 knots, and of course improve my actual consumption performance, which meant I could stay in the air longer if required. On those days at Mara, we were on a grass airfield and used to take off formation, starboard excellent, and on the odd occasion, we did get up to 12, taking off one time. We decided that was a bit hairy, and so we gave it up after that.
The speed and manoeuvrability of the Mosquito made it ideal for low-level bombing as well, and the squadrons quickly became known for their precision attacks.
1 minute, keep on weaving.
Low level was much more exciting role than the high level. The high level, 30,000 feet, was rather sort of cold and sort of distant from everything and rather lonely. But low level, one got the impression of speed and the excitement of virtually almost like sort of from driving a fast car. On the low level raids, of course, we found that by travelling low level that the radar couldn't get much on us. And also we found that by not flying in a straight line more than about 60 miles, we could upset the fighter predictions, even if they didn't get sightings on us. And of course we never attacked targets head on. We used to make for another possible target at an angle away from our main target, then turn onto it at the last moment, so that we could get there without too many people knowing what we were doing. On the low-level side, our speed and maneuverability made our interception very, very difficult. And even when being fired at, as long as they used a fair percentage of tracer, we could miss it by going up and down. Well, we felt we could anyway. Whether we actually did or not, I don't know. But firstly, I didn't get hit, so I assumed it must have had some effect.
The Mosquito soon became a sort of wonder aircraft, sought after by air forces and squadron commanders in every theatre. And by virtue of its superb flying qualities, it was very quickly used for special missions, some of them the most flamboyant and spectacular operations of the war. The strikes on the Gestapo headquarters in the capitals of occupied Europe, and the Amiens prison raid immortalised the spirit of the Mosquito. Squadron leader Parry led the first of these missions to Oslo in September 1942.
I led that raid with 3 other my squadron. We did low level right across the North Sea and then went up the fjord to Oslo, turning around the radio station and lining ourselves up over the centre of the city, which we flew over at rooftop level, and we could just see the headquarters, which we then bombed. Unfortunately, as we were doing our run-up, we encountered 2 Fokker-Wulf 190s, which we hadn't anticipated because we'd been told there were no fighters in the vicinity. One chap was unfortunately shot down, but the other 3 of us managed to get away from them.
By the spring of 1943, Mosquito production was in full swing. New squadrons were formed at bases all over East Anglia, and the aircraft entered service in ever-increasing numbers. The distinctive sounds of the twin Merlin engines could be heard around the clock as Mosquito flights set course for targets all over Europe. The honour of the first daylight raid on Berlin of any Allied Air Force fell to Mosquitoes from Horsham St Faith. And later, they took off from Marham to bomb Berlin at the beginning of an important Nazi rally. It was a major propaganda victory, if not a strategic one. But there was even more spectacular success to come. The Mosquito had been designed to carry 2,000 pounds of bombs, a more than respectable load for such a high-speed machine. Now it was discovered that the bomb load could be quite literally doubled. With a few minor modifications, the Mosquito could carry a 4,000-pound blockbuster bomb. Such a load was comparable with that carried by the four-engine Flying Fortress, the frontline heavy bomber of the American Air Force. With such a bomb, the Mosquito packed a punch not even contemplated a year earlier, and wrote another chapter in the history of aerial warfare.
I know that we marvelled at the performance of the Mosquitoes in carrying these heavy weapons, and I might add that it was not an easy matter. Once that 4,000-pound bomb filled with high explosive was loaded on the Mosquito, it became a little bit unhandy at takeoff. Needed very, very careful flying. And as far as the bomb loads go, of the heavies, well, not all our heavies found their way to Berlin. A lot were shot down on the way. But of the Mosquitoes, for instance, 100 was sent out on one particular night to Berlin. They all got there. You could never do that with heavy bombers, with the four-engine bombers. They were too vulnerable.
Even at the time, official figures suggested that it was possible for the Mosquitoes, in terms of overall effectiveness, to drop 4.5 times the weight of bombs that Britain's top heavy bomber, the Lancaster, could manage. But Bomber Command clung to its concept of the strategic superiority of the heavy bomber. With hindsight, a reappraisal of those policies at the time might have saved the lives of many thousands of Allied aircrew and achieved a more effective destruction of enemy resources. The Allied bombing offensive against Germany was stepped up during the latter half of 1943. But although the bombers were successfully penetrating the German defences, they weren't effectively hitting the target. In fact, on many occasions, the bombers didn't even hit the right town. Highly trained aircrew and vital war materials were nightly being sacrificed, while their effect on the enemy was often less than impressive. Bomber Command was seriously worried by the problem, and it was in the solution to this problem that the Mossie played one of its most vital roles, the role of the Pathfinder. The aircraft's superior speed and ceiling had already helped to mark targets with some success by the use of radio transmissions, but now a new technique was being pioneered by the pilots of the crack 617 Squadron, the famous Dam Busters. Among them was a young squadron leader, Leonard Cheshire, who was to win the VC and become one of the world's best-known bomber pilots.
I think, to me, the Mosquito was the turning point of my war. I was at a time when I had a specific job to do, I mean my squadron and I, and it was a very difficult and crucial one. It involved, to begin with, very low level and very accurate pinpoint marking at night. If that failed, everything else failed. And we had proved that this was the only way to do it, but in a Lancaster. Now, you must remember that Mosquitoes were like gold dust. You just couldn't get a Mosquito. And I felt the Mosquito was the aeroplane to do it. And leaving over the details, I was given it on condition that I could complete successfully one particular mission. When I first flew that Mosquito, I felt that I was in an aeroplane I just like nothing on earth. I mean, it's the queen of the aeroplanes to me.
The results of Cheshire's experiments with Mosquitoes was a degree of accuracy in nighttime bombing which exceeded all predictions. And perhaps the greatest compliment paid to the Mosquito is Group Captain Cheshire's view of the part the aircraft played in the winning of his Victoria Cross.
I think, like everybody who's received that award or any high award, you realize very deeply that you've only won it because you're a member of a team. Of course, I ended with the Dam Buster 617, and that was an elite squadron. And in a sense, that award was partly to the squadron. But I also think that as the end of my flying with 617 was in a Mosquito, and that Mosquito enabled me to do things that otherwise I couldn't have done. It was a contributing factor. Because if you sit back just calmly and think about it, to get a VC, you've got to be in the right place, at the right time. You've got to be seen. And I also think you've got to be successful.
Many famous pilots were to become associated with the Wooden Wonder in the course of the war. It was an aircraft which encouraged pilots to push both themselves and their machines to the limits. But in striking contrast to these more glamorous exploits were the achievements of one quiet and unassuming young officer whose sheer professional dedication was to make him a national hero. John Cunningham was a night fighter pilot who had already notched up considerable success in the first years of the war. He was known everywhere as Cat's Eyes Cunningham, a nickname he heartily disliked. It was derived from the propaganda story that he ate carrots to improve his night vision, a clever and much publicised cover for his very successful use of the first airborne radar system, and it's a myth that still survives. Cat's Eyes Cunningham was a much-decorated wing commander with 16 enemy aircraft to his credit when he converted to the new Mosquito night fighters.
The Mosquito was quite small. The two of us, oneself and one's own radar operator, sitting side by side in the rather limited cockpit space. It needed a little practice to get in and away, started up and away quickly. I can well remember being sent off into the East Anglia direction from Westmoreling, was the airfield in Kent that I was operating from. Quite a number of the incoming raiders were Focke-Wulf 190s, which carried one bomb underneath the centre of the body. And it so happened that this aircraft that we'd been put onto, when I closed in close behind, beneath it, I recognised it fairly quickly as a 190. Being, as it was flying fairly steadily, it was unaware that I was behind it. I came up gently and slowly and gave it a very short burst, and if I remember, a great big flash from it, and it shot down beneath me. It shot away out of my sight, but in hitting it, some of the bits and pieces had come back, and I was well aware almost immediately that I had a lot of steam and coolant coming out of, I think, the port radiator, which was between the engine and the cabin, and that I had to stop one engine as the coolant was lost. So this wasn't the first time this had happened to me in Mosquito, that perhaps bits of perspex or light metal from the aircraft had punctured my own radiator, and I then had to return on one engine to Westmoreling. The Mosquito would fly very well on one engine, but one didn't really enjoy that very much. We returned and made a smooth night landing.
Not all aircraft were able to make it back to base quite so smoothly. And every pilot had his favourite story of just how tough the Wooden Wonder was.
Well, as flight commander, I used to check all the new aircraft arriving on the squadron and, of course, choose the best one I could find. I had one which was a very, very good one, which I hung on to very carefully. But on one occasion, we had a daylight operation on. One of my chaps' aircraft went US at the last moment, so I had to lend him mine. This was a raid on a target in Denmark, and in his enthusiasm, he sort of got as low as he could and sort of hit a house and some high-tension cables, and arrived back with a big hole in his aircraft, with the chimney pot still in it.
The Mosquito had an impressive ability to get back to base, even after extensive damage. Many a crew had good cause to thank de Havillands for the sturdy construction of their aircraft. And as the number of battle-damaged aircraft increased, it became clear that there were some definite advantages to wooden over metal construction.
We have developed the art of using that wood in the Mosquito by a tremendous amount of testing which was carried out at the time, to a point where it became more efficient than the corresponding metal of the day, especially for, say, the top skin of the wing, which is made of this construction of sandwich, where the stringers are supporting the thin plywood sheets, and wherever there's a tendency for the material to buckle, we find that wood is much more efficient than metal.
Not many mosquitoes have survived the years since the Second World War, and at the moment there are only 2 still flying anywhere in the world. But here at Salisbury Hall, the wooden wonder lives on. The grounds of the hall have been transformed into a museum, with a varied collection of de Havilland aircraft on display. Pride of place must go to aircraft number W4050. It was the first prototype, designed and built at the hall, and now the museum's premier exhibit. Nearly 6,000 mosquitoes were produced in the course of the war, and the list of their battle honours seems endless, from the first daylight raid on Berlin to the first pictures of the V weapon sites. The sheer versatility of the design established aeronautical records. From the world's highest flying and fastest operational machine came variants which could carry the 4,000-pound bomb, mines, torpedoes, even a 6-pounder aerial gun for submarine smashing. The Mosquito could fly operational missions right across Europe, almost to the borders with Russia, could knock almost an hour's flying time off the bombing run to Berlin, and help mark targets with pinpoint accuracy. In the fighter version, Mosquitoes claimed almost 700 enemy aircraft, and was outstandingly effective as a night fighter, and all this performance with a casualty rate less than any other type of aircraft on the same missions. Sir Geoffrey de Havilland's unconventional vision of an unarmed high-speed bomber had been transformed by the dedication of skilled men into the wooden wonder, one of the most successful warplanes the world has ever known.
I think it's a shining example of faith that an individual or group of individuals have in something they've designed. Everything was against them. The government didn't want to know, but they felt in their hearts it was right. They totally believed in the cause, the war, the absolute urgency of winning it. And against all odds, they built it. And for me, the Mosquito is a symbol of what Britain did in those 6 years.